Hi, everyone, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. This is my first time at DevOpsDays Seattle, and I really love the vibe. And thank you so much for welcoming me into this community, and I hope to be a part of it moving forward as well. I come from the Bay Area, and the weather here is much better, I would say. It was really hot there, so glad to be here. And thank you for joining me today for DevOps at Netflix. So this talk is not really a technical talk. I'm not going to talk about Kubernetes or how we design DevOps. It's more of about our thought process, how we think about DevOps. And the aim is, at the end of it, if you can go and take some thought from this and see if this can work at your organization. The agenda for the talk is as follows. I'll just briefly talk about myself, what I do at Netflix. We'll talk about Netflix itself, how it builds services, how we think about DevOps, and finally, how our culture permeates through our thinking about DevOps. So I'm a senior software engineer at Netflix. What I do is I build infrastructure to allow Netflix to make movies. So Netflix Studios on the cloud is something that my team supports. I work specifically on the storage infrastructure side, and there are a lot of DevOps concepts that I touch while in my day-to-day work. Before Netflix, I was at companies like Box, Samsung, Apple, Cadence. I'm also a TEDx speaker. I talk on blockchain, cloud computing, distributed systems. Aside from that, I'm an adjunct professor for blockchain and DevOps at University of Advancing Technology in Arizona. So when we think about Netflix, the one thing that you think about is the movies that you watch, right? Our goal at Netflix, and our CEO put it very aptly, was to fight against sleep. Our competitor is sleep. And so we want to ensure that people get entertained and we can provide them that value. To that effect, when we started Netflix, a lot of the things that we developed were on-premise. Cloud was still at a very nascent stage, or I believe it was not even there when Netflix started. So a lot of things were built in-house, and we leveraged whatever we could in terms of managed services. So in order to win these moments of truth, today as it stands, we run our complete compute and storage infrastructure out of AWS. We used to have our CDNs, the content distribution network that distributes the movies across the globe, on Akamai, but we soon realized that we would be best served by having our own CDN. So we wrote up our own code, we open sourced it, and today you can actually go to our open source website and download that code. We call it Netflix Open Connect. We still use Akamai for our UI and small assets, but this is pretty much our infrastructure, in short. Now, when we think about Netflix, the scale that we talk about is humongous. We have 220 million plus members. It was 221. We came down by 1 million yesterday, as you all know. So we are now at 220 million members. We are in more than 150 countries. We have thousands of microservices. Actually, it is, I think, at around 3,000 right now. Thousands of daily production changes on these microservices. Tens of thousands of virtual machine instances. Hundreds of thousands of customer interactions per second. Billions of time series metrics that we collect every quarter. Tens of billions of hours that we stream every quarter. We do that with tens of operations engineers, and we do not have a NOC, or something that looks like a NOC as well. So how do we do this? This is how our architecture looks like. There is not a single person in Netflix who knows what this is, but this is how our microservices talk to each other. And therein lies the power of not having a network operations center or not having a separate DevOps team. So how do we do DevOps really? In the traditional sense, we don't. What we do not do is we do not have systems that say no to our engineers. Everyone has full access to production environment. We don't take time to build systems to have procedures or policies that prevent people from pushing their code. We do not have any push windows. What we do instead have is freedom and responsibility. One of our goals at Netflix is to hire the smart people and get out of the way. If I hire someone who's good at what they do, then it is my job to give them the flexibility and the freedom to choose the way in which they want to solve a problem. And we look for people that take up responsibility rather than it being given to them. So that is a very core concept of our DevOps mindset at Netflix. We do not optimize for uptime at all costs. And this was an interesting part. I used to work at companies that were in the finance sector, healthcare sector, where uptime at all costs is so critical. But for Netflix, we realized that if we have to be a creative organization, then we do not optimize for uptime at all costs. There will be repercussions of downtime, but they are very different in our context versus, let's say, a healthcare company. What we want to optimize on is the velocity of innovation. We price it very highly. I want the engineers that we hire to find new and interesting ways of delighting our customers. And we know that if we have to do that, then as an organization, we'll have to trade some of the uptime. It is not that uptime is not important. It is just that it is not our priority. So we do not believe in having processes and procedures. It is difficult to have a fast-moving organization and have processes and procedures that slow down people. That is a bureaucratic way of thinking. One of the functions of bureaucracies is to take that bureaucratic machine and apply it to virtually any cog and get the output that the bureaucracy desires. That is not what we are doing. What we instead focus on is trust. We want people that are part of Netflix and that grow with Netflix to actually challenge us and suggest newer ways of doing things. That's why we do not have any access control. Anyone and everyone is free to look at the production environment. People have said that, what if someone brings the system down? Well, if you have 3,000 microservices that are constantly interacting with each other, you really need to be very intelligent to bring the system down. And that has happened in the past with Netflix, but it was because we were running out of our data centers. We do not actually have any standards in our company. There is no prescribed language that we use. Today, for example, a lot of the microservices in Netflix are written using Spring Boot. But for example, the project that I work on, I wrote it in C++. And the only reason was I wanted performance. So I work on a Fuse file system. It's, for folks that may know, it's a file system in user space. Fuse is a way to build extensible file systems, and I build a cloud file system. Now, when I compared the performance of Java with C++ and others, I realized that C++ gave us the biggest bang for the buck in terms of performance. So without requiring any approvals, I just went on my path to write my code in C++, do the deployment, and figure out how to package it and roll it out. There's lots of Rust, there's lots of Scala, a lot of JVM related stuff as well, a lot of Node as well. So the point is that there are no standards at Netflix. The engineer has the freedom and the responsibility to pick what is best for a microservice. As long as the APIs are clearly defined and communicated, there is no problem in how you implement it. We do focus a lot on the enablement aspect. Some years ago, UI of Netflix was written in Java. I mean, the backend for the UI was written in Java, and the front end was in JavaScript. And then they realized as a team that it would be better served by using Node.js. So without requiring any approvals, they just went ahead and implemented it in Node.js in a couple of months, and they just pushed it to the website. Sure, it did come down briefly for a minute or so, but then our customers are okay with that kind of an experience if that means that they are delighted by the content that we serve. So this is to say that we do not really have a lot of problems with trying to deploy code. We just rely on the engineers themselves to be the best people to decide how to deploy code, when is the best time to deploy code, what are the configuration parameters to have around deployment. And we do not have traditional silos or walls or fences when it comes where you can imagine an operation engineering group sits behind a fence and waits for the devs to throw the code with the hopes that it will show up in production one day. We don't have any of these. We do not have DevOps engineers at all. All the engineers are expected to know the exact configuration environment, to choose how they want to deploy their code, what tools they need to deploy their code. And for a company of the size of Netflix, this is telling. Because I've worked at smaller companies before, and there was a lot of process around this thing. But at Netflix, it's pretty free form, if you may. Like I said, we try to make ownership easy. We believe in the you build it, you run it, with a focus on enablement. If I write code, it is my responsibility to figure out which cluster groups, how to configure them, what are the availability zones that I need to deploy on, how do I develop configuration parameters and switches so that I can only roll out to one availability zone at a time. So we don't have teams that try to do this. Every engineer figures out how to do this for their microservice. To that effect, we actually created a tool, a platform called Spinnaker, and you can read more about it. It's an open source platform that allows you to push your app to cloud or to other on-premise environments. So we do not traditionally rely on guesses, gut instinct, or tradition. We rely on data. More than anything, Netflix is an enormous data company. And I'm just reading the numbers from here, but like we collected around 5 billion time series metrics last quarter. A vast majority of our decisions are based on data. So when we were starting Netflix, we started with on-premise systems, but in 2008, there was a fire in one of our data centers. And we realized that, we are not in the business of running data centers. That's not our core. That's not the core thing that will win us customers. It's about creating good content and having the ability to stream it well. So we took a conscious decision of moving to cloud, and then today we are completely cloud native. But again, we are reevaluating it because cloud has its own shortcomings. At our scale, the costs are a lot. So when it comes to compute, some of the things that we do around rendering requires a lot of power. And if we were to leverage the cloud instances for that, it would just blow up our budget. So we are now exploring how we can bring some of these things on-premise. This is to say that we are not tied to any philosophy. We keep changing the way we approach problems, and it's also very evident from the way Netflix has grown. We were on-premise, then we became cloud native. Now we are going back to on-premise. We had no ads. Now we are thinking about ads. So it's like it permeates through our thinking about Netflix. So yes, more than anything, we are a data-driven company. So we traditionally don't do the way DevOps is imagined in other companies. We do focus on our culture. So everyone at Netflix is a sworn advocate of the Netflix culture, of freedom and responsibility, and of continuous feedback. We have a philosophy of giving, receiving, and soliciting feedback at any point during the year, and we have no formal processes around it. That is to say that DevOps really is a result of a healthy culture and a healthy thinking. And if whatever I said, if nothing of it resonates with what you're doing at your organization, then maybe it's not that you have a DevOps problem. Just to give a flavor of what DevOps is for me. Oops. So what I work on is I build something like Google Drive. I unimaginatively called it Netflix Drive. It's an edge software. It runs on operating systems like Windows, Mac OS, and CentOS. And as you can imagine, there is very limited opportunity for like CI/CD pipelines to be built around it just because it runs on the edge. For CI and CD, I use Jenkins and Spinnaker, which is our homegrown tool. We have Mac instances that run on AWS, and the deployment model is very different. So I use Brew and PKG on OS X, Yum to install on CentOS, and I use Chocolatey packages on Windows. For logging, I am leveraging Sentry, and we have our own in-house tools and for metrics and observability. I hope this was a short talk, so I hope I was able to give a brief peek into how we think about DevOps at Netflix. And that's my time. Please feel free to ask me any questions. Thank you.
Any questions? Oh.
Yes.
I don't get to throw it far.
Howdy. Excellent talk, thank you. I have a question. You said when it came to ownership, you had an approach of you build it, you run it. How do you deal with ownership transference when that employee inevitably moves on?
That's a very good question.
Thank you.
And there is no white or black answer to this. It's a gray area. We typically we don't have a single point of failure when it comes to ownership. We have teams of folks that work together to build a product. So we've now typically have these API documents and a lot of memos written for any service that are maintained internally by the teams. So it's still a problem area for us where people leave and people move around all the time. But then we feel that we've been able to circumvent it by having microservice-based architectures where each service is small enough that it can act. It's not a monolith where you lose a lot of information when someone leaves. So that gives us that flexibility to allow movement within Netflix and outside of Netflix as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation as well. Speaking of ownership, when someone builds it and they own it, if the service goes down, do they also have to be aware of it and respond to any issues that might happen from that microservice?
Absolutely, yeah. You have the freedom to choose any way you want to deploy. And you have the freedom to also set the boundary conditions of your services. Like, my service can scale up to 1,000 users or 10,000 users or whatever, right? But then if your service goes down, you're responsible for it. And we don't hold that against you because that's the nature, right? Like uptime at all costs is not our motto. We want people to, keep making these microservices and keep expanding the scope of how Netflix can delight their customers. And people enjoy that aspect of our work. So I enjoy that part of my work.
Question over there on that side. Here, catch this one.
Yeah, I think you mentioned about moving some of your applications back into the on-prem infrastructure. Yesterday we had a talk around sustainability, right? So when Netflix makes these decisions, is there a sustainability org within the organization that thinks about these aspects when making these decisions?
Absolutely. We are en route to become carbon neutral by 2030. And when it comes to sustainability in terms of, I'm guessing you're talking about the carbon footprint when we try to bring these things in-house. So we do compensate for it by a lot of techniques that we develop in-house. In fact, in our software development practices as well, we are exploring ways to put calculation of power and energy that it takes to run a piece of code by integrating it as part of our Jenkins pipelines. So sustainability, energy efficiency then becomes a first-class citizen, and it becomes one of the metrics by which we gauge the performance of our services. And yes, we do take care of ensuring that in general, the rule of thumb is cost is a very good metric of knowing how bad your service is for the environment. Even on cloud, if you're paying a lot for some service, it means that it's actually not good for the environment because it produces more heat and it's not sustainable. So by bringing compute, for example, some pieces of compute that we use for rendering in-house, we are not only saving on the costs that it would have, we would have had to pay on the cloud, but inherently we're also saving for the environment, the impact on the environment.
Thank you.
Yeah, and there was one question here as well.
Sure, you can do it. Come on, do it. Yeah.
Given the freedom that each team has to build the way that they want to build, how do the teams communicate their successes and their failures so that they can all learn from each other?
So we have multiple ways of doing that. One of them is, first of all, in general, the communication is just like coding. You have APIs and metrics defined, and you have boundary conditions defined for every microservice. So that actually is communicated very well through code with the partner teams. That's one. And the other is observability and metrics. So we've realized that every service requires some form of metrics and observability on uptime, availability, durability, and these terms have different meaning for different services. So what we've come to a consensus on is that we can leverage an in-house metrics observability platform that can be used by these different microservices. So these are libraries that they can plug into their code if they want, or they can expose dashboards that their partners can use to see how the service or the uptime of the service is. So it's not always clear where the role of a partner team stops and where your role starts, but at least you have the flexibility to reach out to them through the API interface that they have and look at their dashboards to see if something is going wrong. This does complicate our on-call rotations a bit, but it's still okay for the scale at which we operate. It's not too bad.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. My question was, since you were talking about giving developers the ownership of building things their own way, do you still have some archetypes or something to get people easily started on building a new service? Because I believe your internal monitoring, for example, Lambda comes with CloudWatch, but you would want your own monitoring system because all of the good stuff. So just wanted to get your thoughts around how you think about easing the process of getting started.
That's a very good question. So engineers who worked on a microservice, they used Spring Boot initially. They realized that they had to do a lot of configuration or have a layer on Spring Boot. So what they did is they just made it in a way that's generic and just exposed it out. We did not have a separate team to do it. It was the engineers themselves that did that, and then other engineers started using it organically. So that is how we've built layers on top of things that you see or use metrics platforms that have organically been developed by engineers and used by engineers within the company. So if someone has to bootstrap a microservice, there are ways to do that, and there are documents to do that within Netflix itself. But there is no hard and fast rule that this is how you have to do it.
Okay, another question up here.
Yes.
How many Kubernetes clusters do you guys manage?
We don't have Kubernetes. We have our own internally developed platform. We call it Tejas. It's a container and container orchestration platform. So we don't use Kubernetes today.
And one more back here.
Hey, Tejas, first of all, I have a comment and I also have a question.
Sure.
Comment is, this is one of the best presentations I've ever come across. Pretty sweet, short and sweet. Some of the slides, 2 words, never saw any presentation like that. And you conveyed a lot of powerful message of what Netflix does on a day-to-day basis, and it's very informative and very powerful.
Thank
and
you.
very useful for a lot of folks like me, the thought process, right? So that's the comment. The question is, so you mentioned about any engineer can code in whatever language they need and stuff like that. There is no rules and processes. So let's say there are multiple languages, programming languages. You code in something, and let's say you move into a different team, or the engineer moves into a different team, or maybe move out of the company, and the next person has to understand those. The 3,000 microservices multiplied by 3,000 microservices. So there could be a possibility of chaos, right? Because so many microservices, so many programming languages, some engineers are familiar with some and some of them are not familiar with that. How do you manage chaos with this massive environment?
That's a very, very pertinent question. And thank you for your feedback as well. I really appreciate it. So when we think about hiring or engineers in general, what defines an engineer? It's not the languages that you've worked or the tools that you've worked with. It's your ability to be curious. It's your ability to pick up anything and figure it out. And that's what we look for when we hire people. So when I came into Netflix, I did not work with C++ before that. So I was like, let me see what C++ has, and I just started with it. The goal being, first of all, engineers do not need to know about 3,000 microservices. They are hired into a particular team with that needs particular skill sets from engineers or scale experience from them. So they typically will work with 5 or 10 microservices at the max, just the interfaces for their particular services. And they can, of course, expand that. And the other thing is that we believe in a continuous feedback loop. So whenever you choose any language or any tool to implement a microservice, you are expected to maintain some form of documentation. And someone can always come in and question you, like, why did we choose this language? What were the metrics behind it? Or using data to inform everyday decisions is something that we've gotten better at Netflix. So in some ways, that part is taken care of. And the expectation from an incoming engineer is not that they should know everything. It's about they should be able to question it. And if needed, rewrite it in some other language or some other way that they feel this is best. In fact, traditionally, I have worked at companies where, the managers are very technical people. You become an engineer, you grow into like managing a team of people, and you're still very technical. At Netflix, for example, my manager may not be the most technical person around. He would rely on me and my ability to solve the problems. And that's how we've kept Netflix, and that's how our leadership is more of people management than technical insights. So far, we've hired only senior engineering people that have gone through this cycle, that are well aware of the nuances of choosing languages, tools, and also understanding that you're not married to a language or a tool or a service. And when we look for internal movement within Netflix, these are some of the factors we look into as well when we are looking at people. So I hope that answers some part of your question.
We have time for one more. Okay.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. I really like the idea of engineering autonomy. How the biggest thing that I try and work on with my sort of management team and I try and understand, and I'd be really curious how Netflix does it at scale, is making sure everyone's rowing in the same direction. There's a lot of points of value out there in the world that we're trying to reach. And if you give engineers the autonomy to do what they think is best, how do you, as an organization, communicate to each engineer sort of what the goals of Netflix are and keep them aligned in that direction?
Sure, yeah. So we break it down, and this is an interesting thing because this is where we have some amount of process. We have company-wide goals when it comes to product, when it comes to engineering. And then we see how every engineer that is working, whatever they're doing in their day-to-day work, how is it adding to the company-wide goal? And every engineer has the freedom to say that, I don't think what I'm working on adds to the company's value or whatever our OKR or metrics are for the quarter. And we figure out ways in which we can help them be on that path. Also, I'm a part of the platform organization. So for platform, like for example, moving on to a newer version of thrift or deprecating thrift is our goal for this quarter, let's say. So every engineer somehow has to figure out a way that they can contribute to that. This is how we keep some alignment, but keep strongly aligned but loosely coupled engineering practices is our goal. And that's how we try to circumvent this problem.